I'm the kind of person who hears a strange noise at night and assumes it's the wind, or a raccoon, at worst. Monsters don't exist and ghost stories are just that, stories. At least that's what I've always told myself. But I can't explain what happened to me that night. I had heard of skinwalkers before. The name alone is enough to send shivers down your spine. According to legend, they're shapeshifters, beings that can take on the form of animals or even humans. Some say they're witches cursed by dark rituals. Others say they're ancient spirits feeding on fear. They mimic voices calling for help in tones that sound human but lack emotion, luring unsuspecting victims closer. I always brushed it off as folklore, just stories told to scare people from venturing too far into the wilderness. I never gave it much thought until I found myself in a situation that made me wonder if those stories were more than just tales. Life had been weighing on me. Work had become a relentless grind. Family tensions were at an all-time high, and even my friends seemed to drain me. I needed a break, somewhere to clear my head. That's how I found myself packing for a solo camping trip. No one to bother me, no deadlines, no expectations, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive to the campsite was long, winding through forested roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I decided on a secluded spot, miles away from any trailheads or public camping areas. I wanted solitude, and I got it. By the time I arrived at the trailhead and started hiking, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I made my way deeper into the woods, something caught my eye. A deer stood motionless a few yards off the trail, staring directly at me. Its body was perfectly still, too still, as though it were frozen in time. Its eyes were unnerving, not soft and curious like most deer, but sharp and focused. It felt like it was studying me. I kept walking, brushing it off as my imagination. But then there was another one. A second deer stood farther ahead, staring in the same unsettling way, and another. Each one seemed to appear out of nowhere, their heads turning slowly to watch me as I passed. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't move away either. It was as though they were trapped in some sort of trance, and for a moment I felt like I was too. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the spell broke. The deer shook their heads, snorted, and bounded off into the woods like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a coincidence, but unease crept in like a shadow I couldn't shake. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my gut. About halfway to my chosen campsite, I saw a man wandering through the trees. He was swaying slightly, his movements uneven, like he might be drunk. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his head was down, his face obscured. I thought about saying something, a quick, "Hey, you good?" But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he moved, slow and erratic, like he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. Or maybe it was the strange sensation that washed over me, a feeling like I shouldn't draw attention to myself. He didn't seem to notice me, and I passed him without incident. I told myself he was just a guy enjoying the woods in his own way. But deep down, I knew better. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had almost set. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and tried to relax. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But that stillness didn't bring peace. It felt oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. I was starting to feel a little better when I heard it. "Help! Help me!" It was a man's voice, distant but clear. The words carried through the trees, echoing faintly. At first, I thought someone might actually be in trouble. I stood, straining to listen. "Help me! Over here!" The voice came again, but this time, something about it felt wrong. The tone was too flat, too monotone, like someone mimicking a call for help rather than genuinely needing it. It lacked urgency. "Help me," the voice repeated, almost like a recording. The same inflection, the same rhythm, over and over. It was closer now, but I couldn't see anyone. My skin crawled. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but something in the back of my mind screamed, "Don't." I sat back down by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The voice kept calling, Circling my campsite, it would fade into the distance, then grow louder again, moving in an erratic pattern. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding. I felt like I was being watched. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent my heart racing. I stayed in my tent, clutching a knife, waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward my truck. As I passed the spot where I'd seen the man the day before, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. But they weren't normal footprints. They were barefoot, long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They led off the trail and disappeared into the dense woods. I didn't stick around to investigate. I made it back to my truck, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away from that forest. To this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered out there. Was it just a drunken man lost in the woods, or something far darker? A skinwalker, perhaps, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I'll never be sure. I've spent years camping alone in remote areas across the country. No one who's ever traveled as much as I have would bat an eye at a few rustling leaves or the distant call of an animal. But the night I spent in Rabbit Valley changed everything. It was a quiet evening. Too quiet, maybe. I'd been driving for hours, crossing the border between Colorado and Utah, and I needed to rest. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a place far enough from the highway to sleep without the hum of cars or the glare of streetlights. Rabbit Valley seemed like the perfect spot. It was desolate, surrounded by nothing but wide open space and rugged terrain. I'd heard about it from other campers as a peaceful, remote site, ideal for solitude. So, I parked my truck at one of the isolated campsites, which were at least 15 to 20 miles from the nearest road. There was only one other rig in the area, and they were far off in the distance. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. It was quiet. I set up my teepee-style tent, a new purchase off of Amazon. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me sheltered from the elements. The air was cold, crisp, and still, just the way I liked it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I got settled in, ready to drift off. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the serene quiet, but it didn't last long. I woke to an odd sound, something faint but persistent. It started out as a scraping noise, almost like someone dragging their fingers across the nylon of my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a light, deliberate sound, like someone was walking around my tent, running their fingers along the edges of the fabric. Slowly, methodically, back and forth, I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything outside my tent. There were no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart began to race. It was as if someone was walking in a slow circle around my tent, deliberately making sure I could hear every scrape of their fingers. The sound was eerily rhythmic, like they had all the time in the world. Minutes dragged on. Maybe it was only 5 minutes. Maybe it was 15. It felt like an eternity. I tried to steady my breath, to remain calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scraping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited, my mind racing. Every inch of me screamed to act, to do something, but I didn't. I stayed there, silent, listening. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, some animal brushing up against the tent. But something inside me knew better. Another 15 minutes passed. The silence now felt suffocating. Then, without warning, it happened. My tent, the one I'd just pitched with such care, suddenly caved in. The center pole collapsed, and the entire structure folded inward, trapping me inside. I had a brief moment of disorientation, and I realized the only thing holding the tent at an angle was a small support beam that had somehow managed to stay intact. My heart was hammering in my chest as I ripped open the zipper of my tent. I didn't think, I just acted. I bolted out of the tent and ran for my truck. I crawled into the bed, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the grip, but I didn't feel safe enough to sleep. I stayed wide awake the entire night, waiting for daylight. The darkness outside seemed to close in on me, as if something were waiting for me to fall asleep. When the sun finally rose, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and went straight back to the campsite. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just my nerves? Was I imagining it? But deep down I knew I wasn't. Something was off, very off. I went to inspect the area, hoping to find some sign that would explain it away. Maybe it was a bear or a large animal that brushed up against the tent. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on, and that's when I saw them. Around my tent, in the cold desert dirt and snow, there were shoe prints. They weren't mine. I recognized my own tracks, leading to and from the campsite, but these were different. They were made by boots with pointed toes, deep imprints in the ground. The pattern they made was unmistakable. It was clear that someone had walked around my tent. Not just once, but multiple times. The prints were in a circle, as though someone had been pacing around me while I was inside. There were no other tracks, just these circular prints, making a steady loop around my tent, as if whoever it was had been studying me, waiting, watching. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when it hit me. They had known I was inside. They knew I was alone. They had been waiting for me to make a move, and the sound I'd heard, the scraping, it wasn't a random animal, it was deliberate. Someone had been touching the fabric of my tent. Someone had been taunting me. I looked further into the valley, hoping for an explanation, but the tracks, those boots, had wandered off into the wilderness, leading further into the desolate land. There were no signs of any other campsites, no vehicles in sight, just an empty, barren landscape stretching out before me. Whoever had been there wasn't coming back, but I didn't stick around to see if they would. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I threw my things into my truck, locked the doors, and drove off without a second thought. I didn't even care about the rest of the day's drive. All I cared about was getting out of there. I didn't look back. To this day, I haven't been back to Rabbit Valley, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, every time I go camping, every time I set up a tent and sit beneath the stars, I can't shake that feeling. The feeling of someone watching, someone waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. And every time the wind picks up and I hear a scrape on the side of my tent, I remember those boot prints. I remember the circle they made around me. I remember the eerie silence of that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the valley. I don't know if they were real or if it was all in my head. But I do know this. I'll never forget the sound of someone scraping their fingers across the side of my tent.